Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we have a couple of things to discuss, including a signing, a couple of PTO updates, a few news updates surrounding the Jackets head coaching position, as well as updates surrounding the Blues captain. And we also have a couple of trade rumors to discuss involving teams like the Avalanche, Devils, Predators, Canucks, Canadiens, and Senators. We'll go to all of that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the Intent Hockey Channel. As usual, I'll kick things off today by discussing a couple of signings that have happened over the past couple of days. Only one signing over the past couple of days, but it was a pretty significant one, as one of the better free agents left in the free agent market, Khaira, who's been spending time as a bomb six for the past couple of years in places like Chicago and the Edmonton Oilers, has signed a one-year, two-way deal, league minimum deal, so $725,000, with the Minnesota Wild. Now, Khaira has been a really good physical bomb six forward over the past couple of years for teams like the Oilers and Hawks. He's a really good bomb six forward. He can play easily fourth line minutes. He's also a pretty good penalty killer, so he's a very versatile player. He can play in a variety of different situations. This past year, he put up 6 goals and 8 assists, 14 points in 51 games with the Blackhawks. He has dealt with a couple of injuries in the past for the Hawks and the Oilers, so he was injured a couple of times last year, but he's still a fantastic bomb six forward. So in my eyes, he's going to be a fantastic player for the Wild. They could use a bomb six forward. They lost a couple of guys like Ryan Reeves last year, so they brought in Patrick Maroon, but I think they could have used some more depth. So he's probably going to challenge with guys like Connor Dvorak and Patrick Maroon for consistent fourth line minutes, and he's going to be a fantastic either 12th, 13th forward. I could see him be a consistent fourth line forward. I could also see him be more of a spare on a day-to-day basis, but still, it's a fantastic signing. Khaira's a really good bomb six forward, can help in the penalty kill. There's a good variety of different situations. Maybe not playing every single game of the NHL season for the Wild, but I definitely do think he's going to stand a really good chance to be a consistent bomb six forward. So not too much to talk about here, but Khaira, who's a solid bomb six forward and can help on the penalty kill, signs with the Minnesota Wild and gives them a little bit more depth. So good to see that he goes there. He did not go on a PTO, so he gets a straight contract right out of the gate, and Khaira is going to join the Minnesota Wild for the upcoming season. That's all the only signing we have to talk about here today. We're going over to a couple of PTO updates. We have 3 more PTO updates since the last time we talked. None really significant, but the Dallas Stars have signed goalie Christopher Gibson to a PTO. The San Jose Sharks have signed forward Justin Bailey to a PTO, and the St. Louis Blues have signed Andy Welinski to a PTO. So not really any significant ones there. Christopher Gibson's a decent third, fourth string goaltender. He's not an NHL goaltender at this point in time. So Gibson, just like Halverson, who we talked about a couple of days ago, maybe a week ago, who signed a PTO in Dallas, I'm most likely going to be challenging for like a third, fourth role, possibly to be signed with the Dallas Stars. Both are decent depth goaltenders, and I could see him be challenging with a guy like Matt Murray for being the third stringer in Dallas. So I think Gibson has an opportunity there to possibly be like a third stringer in Dallas and maybe earn himself a two-way contract and be placed on waivers. But I definitely don't think he's going to be able to beat out guys like Wedgwood or Onger in the roster. So I definitely do think that he's most likely playing for like a third string role in Dallas. So I wouldn't be surprised if Gibson did get maybe an NHL contract and was sent to the minors. But he's going to be a guy to watch out for. Bailey, decent depth forward in San Jose, has a little bit of NHL experience playing in a couple of other NHL cities. But he's at best a bomb six forward, if not an NHL spare, most likely an NHL forward. So I would think that he'd be just some added depth for the Sharks if they were to sign him. So going to be interesting to see, but I would expect that's most likely the case, and that Bailey would most likely be like a guy who signs a two-way deal and is sent to the minors. So that's going to be interesting to see, but I wouldn't expect Bailey to most likely get a two-way deal. I would expect him to most likely challenge for a PTO, maybe get a two-way deal, but I would also expect him to make the roster. So we're going to have to wait and see how Justin Bailey does at PTO and how he does in training camp. Blues, same sort of thing. They sent Andy Welinski. Krug is injured to start the season, so maybe this is going to be at some added depth. Welinski has NHL experience, but is mostly a spare defenseman, like a 7th defenseman right now, if not an AHL defenseman. So maybe they add him as like some added depth for that team. But I would not be overly shocked if Welinski signed as like a depth piece and was sent to the minors. But just like Bailey in San Jose, just like Gibson in Dallas, I would not expect him to sign a 2-way NHL contract to make the NHL roster. So going to be interesting to see, but these are the only 3 PTO updates we have right now. Welinski in St. Louis, he's a decent depth defenseman. Bailey in San Jose, decent depth forward. Gibson in Dallas, decent third-string goaltender. If they were to get a 2-way contract to the NHL level, I would expect most of these guys to probably have to be sent to the minors, as I don't think any of those guys stand a good chance to make an NHL roster at this point in time. But going to be interesting to see, I'd probably say maybe Christopher Gibson gets a 2-way contract, maybe Justin Bailey. I think those will have to be my 2 most likely, but I think there's a really good chance that all 3 of Bailey, Gibson, and Welinski will most likely just not get NHL contracts and they'll just have PTOs. But good to see they got PTOs, and hopefully they can do good in training camp and show that they're still ready for NHL contracts. So going to be interesting to see there. Going over to a few news notes here before we get to some trade rumors. So we have a situation in Columbus that I really need to discuss here. This situation happened probably a little bit earlier last week and has had some major ramifications for the Columbus Blue Jackets. So as we know, back in early June, there was announced by a couple of really good reporters that on July 1st, the Columbus Blue Jackets were going to name former Maple Leaf head coach Mike Babcock the new head coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets. It turned a lot of people's heads. It was a bit of a surprising move. No one really thought that Mike Babcock stood a good chance to make it back to the NHL. We heard some rumors about a team like the Rangers possibly interviewing him. We heard some rumors about possibly the Jackets interviewing them, but people just thought there was just interviews. But then the Jackets wound up hiring Babcock, and it was really a weird move to bring Babcock back to the NHL, but that's what they wound up doing. They signed to a 2-year deal, around a $4 million AAV to become the Jackets head coach. It seemed like things were going well up until about last week when on the Spin Chicklets podcast, Paul Bissonnette said that he had a source telling him that Mike Babcock was demanding to be looking through players' phones and was sort of possibly invading players' privacy. We know that Babcock has a history of maybe not treating the players the best, especially sort of the younger players. Later that day, Babcock and Jenner came out with statements saying that Babcock did ask to look through players' phones, but according to Jenner, it was just family pictures, just trying to get to know him better, which seemed all right at the time, and it seemed like Jenner didn't really have anything bad to say about Babcock, so at that point in time, it looked like it was pretty okay. Even Johnny Gaudreau spoke, talking to Elliot Friedman, saying that he had the exact same thing. Babcock had asked him to look at some family pictures to just sort of see what he was doing in the summer. It seemed all pretty well and fine at that point in time. That was a couple of days ago, so it seemed like Jenner and Gaudreau were all right with what Babcock was asking, but the NHLPA did launch an investigation over the past couple of days. They were trying to dig deep into what really happened, and then it really sort of sounded like this situation was getting a little bit messy. Friedman talked about it multiple times on this past couple of podcasts, and he thinks that some of the younger players might have been where the problem was occurring. He said that the veteran players like Jenner, like Gaudreau, might have been a little more okay, but some of the younger players, given the fact that the Jackets are made up with a much younger team than one of the younger teams in the league, might have not been all right with having Babcock ask for permission to look through some of their photos of what they did in the summer. And it just seemed like it was getting into a really big mess over in Columbus. So just a couple days ago on Sunday, Mike Babcock did announce that he was going to resign as head coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets and that he was going to be stepping down. And the Columbus Blue Jackets promptly promoted assistant coach Pascal Vincent to be the new head coach. So that was a messy situation that happened. It sounded like there was a couple of meetings. Elliot Friedman said that there was one meeting in particular that happened away from players' facilities involving a phone for a couple of hours that really had the NHLPA a little bit worried. It sounded like Babcock's old coaching ways really didn't resonate well with some of the younger players. I saw a couple of reports saying some of the younger players didn't really want him to be the head coach. It just sounded like like, oh, it was a really messy situation. So even though it sounded earlier in the week like it was just some innocent asking of photographs for some of the people, just asking what they did in the summer and just trying to get to know the players better, it just seems like some of the younger players were not overly thrilled with what they had to do and felt like it was sort of an invasion of privacy. So it seems like Babcock's old ways that really didn't help him in Toronto. I mean, we know that he had a really bad history with the younger players in Toronto. It just seemed like it was a really bad thing to be happening for the Jackets. And I think Elliot Freeman put this point clear, and I think I really do agree with him here. Babcock, with his past, with the way he exited Toronto, he really needed to have like a squeaky clean run in Columbus where he didn't have anything go wrong against him to keep that job. And after all of this stuff came out, I think it was just probably not going to work for Babcock. So Babcock's gone. He's resigned from Columbus. That was a messy situation. I do really wonder what happens with the GM upcoming next, because Ken Kalinin did wind up hiring the coach. At this point in time, it sounds like nothing's going to happen to Ken Kalinin, but I thought Babcock could possibly do well in a second chance. I was questioning why the Jackets would go with Babcock when there were a couple of other head coaches who could definitely work with the Columbus Blue Jackets, but I thought maybe Babcock with a second chance, maybe he could change his ways, maybe he could be a better head coach than he was when he finished in Toronto a couple of years ago. He's had a couple of years to work at fixing his coaching stuff, and hopefully he could be a better NHL coach now, and it just seems like it didn't work out. So I think the right move for Babcock was to resign. It was probably the right thing to do with how messy that situation was getting, and now Pascal Vincent's going to be the new head coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets. Vincent, definitely someone who a lot of people think really deserved an NHL role as a head coach. He's been an associate coach with the Columbus Blue Jackets these past couple of years. He's coached at multiple different levels, and a lot of people said that, even Freeman said that if Babcock was not the head coach, a lot of people thought Pascal Vincent could have been one of the internal options to be the new head coach if they hadn't signed Babcock, and now he is going to be their new head coach. So good for Pascal Vincent. Sounds like this was a long time coming for him, and hopefully he's a really good head coach. I think he did sign a 2-year extension instead of just on an interim basis, so he's probably going to be the Jackets head coach for the next couple of years, but just a really messy situation in Columbus with Babcock. I think it was the right move for Babcock to resign, and going to be interesting to see what else comes of this. But Babcock resigns. That situation's now over, and definitely I think, even though it sounded like things were doing really well, a lot better after the Boudreau interview and the Jenner statement, and it sounded like everything was going well, it sounds like there was a couple of incidents that possibly happened for Babcock, and that led to him being resigned. So Babcock resigns from Columbus, and he's now going to be not the head coach, and Pascal Vincent, who's a very deserving candidate, takes over as the head coach for the Jackets just only a few days before training camp. So going to be interesting to see what else happens here, but that's all I'm going to talk about here today for the Jackets head coach. Definitely love to hear your thoughts on the situation down in the comments. Also, before we go over to trade rumors, I got one more thing here to discuss, and that's that the St. Louis Blues later today will be naming a new captain to their team. Definitely a really, really good option here for the Blues to do this. We know they were one of the 8 teams that we've been talking about that did not have a captain after Vancouver and Winnipeg named captains, including teams like the Hawks and the Ducks and the Bruins that didn't have captains. The Blues are one of those 8 teams that were still without a captain. Later today, they're most likely going to name a captain. They've already announced that they're going to. Probably going to happen in a couple of hours here, so by the time this hits YouTube, we'll probably know the Blues captain. So at the recording of this video, I have not seen any Blues players be named captain of the St. Louis Blues yet, so at this point in time it hasn't happened, but by the time this hits YouTube, it'll probably be happened already, so most likely everyone will know who the captain is. In my opinion, I would probably think it's a player with a little more of a long-term contract. Players that come to mind will be Robert Thomas. I think he'll be a fantastic young captain for the Blues. Jordan Khaira, who's also on a really good contract. Maybe a little bit less likely, but I think Khaira could definitely be a good captain. Brayden Schenn, who's been in St. Louis for the past number of years, is on a long-term contract. I think he could be a fantastic captain for that team. Buchnevich is a little bit less likely, given the fact he's only on a couple of years left on his contract. But he's been a really good leader. I could see him be captain. Justin Falk on the defensive end, he could be another guy who I see as being the captain of the St. Louis Blues. He's got a couple more years left on his contract, so he's also a really good leader. So I could see some of these guys, maybe Falk, Thomas, Khaira, Schenn, one of these guys possibly be named the new captain of the St. Louis Blues. I would probably think it's one of those guys, maybe Parayko. That's possible. I would probably say one of those guys. So going to be interesting to see, but I'll probably say most likely would be one of Schenn, Thomas, or Khaira, maybe Falk, but I think it will probably be one of those four, given that they're all signed for longer-term deals, and they're all pretty big pieces of that organization. So going to be interesting to see, but the Blues will name their new captain later today, and we'll discuss it on our next news video, who they name captain, and how I think that captain should do in the St. Louis Blues organization for this upcoming season, as they have not had a captain since they traded Captain Ryan O'Reilly to Toronto Maple Leafs during last year. And now going over to a couple of trade rumors we got to discuss here today. So we got a couple of trade rumors we want to discuss. First, discussing a couple of things regarding a couple of prospects that could be moved closer towards the trade deadline. I saw this from a couple of different sources. One said that the Colorado Avalanche could look to move top prospect and former first-round pick Oskar Olausson closer to the trade line if they really wanted to have a major improvement in their roster. And another rumor I saw said that the New Jersey Devils may wind up doing the exact same thing with another former first-round pick in Chase Stillman. So these are a couple of really good prospects. They're former first-round picks. Now, both of these guys were actually first-round picks in 2021. Olausson was 28th overall. Stillman was 29th overall. So they both have familiarity being former first-round picks. I think both could garner really big interests. Once again, both these teams most likely going to be playoff teams this year. Jersey, we saw last year, take a huge step forward. The Avalanche are still really good playoff contenders, even though they may not be the cup contender that they were when they won the cup a couple of years ago. But if the Avalanche are looking for help on the defensive end, is it possibly a second or third pair defenseman, or possibly a middle or bottom six forward? If the Devils are looking for a little bit of defensive help on the second or third pair, if they're looking for a middle or bottom six forward, if they're looking for some goaltending help, and we don't even know what injuries are going to occur before the trade deadline. I think the Devils and Avalanche are going to be teams who are heavily interested in looking to add before the deadline. The Devils look to be a solid NHL team, so do the Avalanche by that matter. The Avalanche stand a good chance to win the Central this year. I think the Devils stand a good chance to be a top-end team in the Metro. I think both these teams stand a good chance to add towards the deadline. And I think there's a likely possibility that the Devils and the Avalanche could wind up moving these two players. Once again, I think both are former first-round picks. Both probably have some potential to be at the very least top 9, if not top 6 forwards at the NHL level. And I think for teams who are looking to get younger, rebuild, or looking to move maybe a pending UFA, or they have a player who they're looking to move, I think there would be of interest, both Olausson and Stillman. So definitely going to be interesting to see, but I definitely think that if we get closer to the trade line and the Avalanche and Devils are in playoff positions looking to add before the deadline, I think Stillman in Jersey and Olausson in Colorado, or both those guys are not top-end prospects, but are pretty good prospects who I think both the Avalanche and Devils will be willing to move for the right price. So definitely, I think both Olausson and Stillman, both two good young former first-round prospects, could be on the move at the deadline, and it's going to be interesting to see if they are. Going over to the Montreal Canadiens, a recent article from Aaron Basu of The Athletic said that the Montreal Canadiens' best trade chip in season may be Christian Dvorak. He said that Dvorak is a really good player. Dvorak's sort of injured right now to start the season. He may miss the start of the season, but he said once he gets back, Dvorak has the potential to be a really, really good trade option for the Canadiens. He's a decent second, third line center. He showed that in Arizona. He's a really good two-way center. He can put up points. In Montreal, he has not been able to find that game that he had in Arizona. He was brought in by the Montreal Canadiens a couple of years ago to replace Philip Deneau in that lineup, and he really hasn't, and he's sort of become a really big trade chip for them. Now, if he can go back to playing like putting up 40, 50 points, being a good second-line center who can be a good two-way player, if Dvorak goes back to being that sort of player that he was in Arizona, there would be a ton of teams interested in him, because there was already a ton of teams interested in him when he was in Arizona and when the Canadiens wound up moving a first and third round pick for him. So it's going to be interesting to see if they could possibly move him. I would think if he can put up maybe somewhere between 30 and 40 points by a deadline, and be a solid two-way center who can definitely improve a team's center depth. He's also signed for the next 2 years. So if he's showing it flashes of pretty good two-way center, second-line center again, I think there will be some teams interested in him. He would have the rest of this year plus next year at a $4.5 million cap hit. If the Canadiens could possibly get like a second-round pick and a decent prospect for him, I would think they would definitely be willing to move him. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I would definitely agree with him that Dvorak is possibly one of their more likely trade candidates, possibly around the deadline. Another guy I think would be Sean Monahan. I think Monahan and Dvorak are really good middle six forwards. They could probably slot in the middle six with the Canadiens. They could play with some of their younger players like a Duck, like a New Hook, like Gallagher possibly, like Slavkovsky, like maybe Anderson. They could play with a couple of guys who are more offensively minded, bump up their stats, teams become a little more interested in them, and they become a little more likely to be traded. So in my eyes, yes, I do think Dvorak stands a really good chance to possibly be moved by a trade deadline. I would say exact same for Monahan. And it would not surprise me at all that if Dvorak goes back to being a solid two-way second-line center that he was in Arizona, there would be a ton of teams interested in him, and I think the Canadiens could wind up moving him. So going interesting to see there. Going over to Nashville Predators, in an article by Joe Rexrod of The Athletic, he said that the Nashville Predators, if they're out of the playoffs, or by around the trade line, may be willing to move UC Saros. Now, we know that Saros is the star goaltender in Nashville, and he's an extremely big piece of the organization. He was a major reason why the Predators held into fighting for a playoff spot for so long last year. They moved a lot of pieces, and they looked like a team who was not supposed to be competing for a playoff spot, yet they kept pace with teams like Calgary and Winnipeg in the West and fought until the very, very last for that last playoff spot. They did miss, but they put up one heck of a fight. So, given that fact for the Nashville Predators, it seems like it's extremely likely that Saros will be a big piece of that Nashville team. And if they're making the playoffs, they are not moving Saros. But if they're a little bit out of the playoffs and they're not going a guarantee to make the playoffs, I think there's a possibility Saros could be moved. Saros is a solid player, but Saros is also signed for the next couple of years. So if they move him, it would not be a rental like possibly a Hellebuck. It would be a guy who they're moving for this year and next year. So our team could get like a star goaltender for both this upcoming season and the next year. So that'll be a big improvement for a team, unlike Hellebuck, who's probably going to be possibly moved if the Jets do move him as a rental. The Preds can move Saros to help both the rest of this upcoming season and then the entirety of next year. So that'll be appealing to a lot of teams who need some goaltending help. On top of that, unlike the Jets really can't move Hellebuck right now because they have no prospect in their system who can really just take over as a starting role. The Preds do. The Preds have Yaroslav Askarov, who is a former first-round pick, weighing in the wings, who looks to be a fantastic future franchise goaltender. So if the Preds move Saros, they can trust Askarov to be the goaltender of the future as early as this year. They could probably have Lankinen and Askarov finish as like a tandem, and then they could have Askarov be the starter next year. So I would definitely think it's possible. I would definitely not think it's extremely likely, especially if the Preds are in a playoff spot. But if the Preds are out of it, just given the fact that Saros could be a guy who helps the team for 2 years, not just one like Hellebuck, they have a prospect goalie in Askarov who can come in and be their new goaltender, and the return they could get on Saros would be extremely high. I think they could easily get a first-round pick, prospect, a young player, if not more. So I definitely think the Preds could definitely look to move Saros. Teams like Edmonton and LA would come to mind, who could easily benefit from having a star top-end level goaltender. Maybe there's a couple of other teams out there too, but those two teams, if Saros was available around the deadline, would make the most sense in my opinion. But definitely, if the Preds are out of the playoffs, they don't look like they're making the playoffs, they feel really confident in Askarov being their starting goaltender, I do think we'll have to watch out for Saros being a possible trade candidate closer to the trade deadline. Going over to Vancouver Canucks, recently on his radio show, Rick Dhaliwal did say that the Canucks are really aggressively trying to move a body and trying to move a body before the season starts. We know that we've said over the past little while the Canucks need to move a forward before the season starts, or at least some sort of a contract. We've talked about Tyler Myers being possibly a trade chip. We've talked about Brock Besser. We've talked about Anthony Beauvillier. We've talked about Connor Garland. We've said so many possible options there for the Canucks to possibly move some roster spots. There's also a possibility of maybe moving Tanner Pearson if they can. There's a lot of options there for Canucks, but they have such a crowded team with a lot of high-priced wingers that it seems like they're having a little bit of a trouble moving some of them. We've already said that Besser was a problematic contract that they couldn't move earlier. Bouvillier makes over $4 million. Garland makes over $4 million. Neither have really played overly well over the past couple of years to justify their cap hit. Pearson's coming off of injury. It's going to be extremely hard to trade. Even though Meyer's actual money is only I think $1 million, his cap hit is $6 million, which will be extremely hard for a lot of teams to make do. And the Canucks will probably have to clear between $1.5 and $3 million in cap space to become cap compliant, with Pearson most likely being healthy to start the season. So it's going to be interesting to see, but it sounds like the Canucks are aggressively trying to move at least one player, if not a couple, to try and improve this team and have them be a lot better this year. And lastly here, going over to the Ottawa Senators, there's been a lot of talk recently about Shane Pinto. Like we said, the consensus is that the Senators are still trying to sign Pinto to a reasonable deal and trade a guy who really doesn't make a lot of money and would help them sign Pinto, like maybe move Eric Brandstrom or Mathieu Joseph. Still think those two are the most likely. I still think that's the most likely option. Pinto signs like a 1, maybe 2-year deal between $2 and $3 million AAV. The Sens move either Mathieu Joseph or Eric Brandstrom to free up the necessary cap space, and they're cap compliant. But there's been a lot of talk that Pinto and Ottawa are far apart on a contract extension. It sounds like maybe Ottawa's trying to sign him to a little bit lower, given the fact it's been a really, really difficult time to move a contract, and maybe Pinto's values himself a little bit higher. But Pinto's also a guy who can't be offer sheeted. He's not an RFA who can be offer sheeted, so it gives the leverage a lot more to Ottawa instead of Pinto. So it sounds like the contract negotiations aren't going overly well right now. They should still be able to find even ground on a contract extension, but still, Pinto's a really good player. So according to Elliot Friedman on his podcast he did on Friday, he said that some teams have checked in possibly on Pinto and his availability, and teams like the Boston Bruins, who we did talk about a little while ago, plus the Philadelphia Flyers, have checked in on Pinto. Now, he also said that if Pinto's possibly being moved, it's very unlikely, but if Pinto was to be moved, he said that the Sens know they can get a really good player for him, and that the Sens would have to also move a contract, most likely someone like Mathieu Joseph, as well as Pinto, in a possible trade. Now, if that's the case, I really highly doubt that the Bruins are going to be a team who winds up making this trade because, one, Pinto's an unsigned RFA. He needs about, like we said, $2.5 million to sign an extension. But two, they would also need to move Mathieu Joseph. So if they're moving $5 million in cap space to the Bruins and not taking back any sort of cap hit that's more than Joseph's $2.9 million, that would really not work for Boston, given the fact they're also a team who's cap strapped. So as much as I think that the Bruins have been mentioned numerous times now for being interested in Pinto, unless they can move someone else, possibly not to Ottawa, maybe to another team to free up cap space, I don't think that's going to happen. They're going to need to sign Pinto to $2.5 million, and they're in the same position that Ottawa's in. So I really don't see Boston being able to pull that off. Philly, on the other hand, is a different story. Philly's a young team. They're rebuilding. They have over $7 million in cap space with Ryan Ellison in long-term injury reserve. They would have the cap space enough to sign Pinto and possibly even take on a Mathieu Joseph contract. So it's going to be interesting to see. It sounds like there was even an offer tabled by the Philadelphia Flyers to acquire Pinto and Joseph for Philadelphia Flyers player. I'm not exactly sure which player was not mentioned, but it sounds like the Philadelphia Flyers did have interest. It sounds like the Flyers and Bruins at this point in time have moved on, and at this point in time, in the past couple of days, have not really checked in on Pinto or with the Senators, so it sounds like those two have sort of had their discussions and moved on, but it's quite possible they could circle back to them, so it's going to be interesting to see. But if Pinto was traded, I could see guys like Scott Laughton be of interest to the Ottawa Senators. Travis Konechny could possibly be of interest. I could even see a younger guy like a Morgan Frost possibly be of interest. Frost, Laughton, and Konechny all make a ton of sense to possibly go to Ottawa, but it'd have to be for the right deal if they are moving on from Pinto, who's a fantastic young player. So not saying it's going to happen. I still think it's more likely that the Sens move on a contract and sign Pinto to like a $2.5 million deal. I think that's the most likely scenario, but it does sound like teams like the Flyers and the Bruins have interest in possibly bringing in Pinto to help their center depth. So going to be interesting to see, but that's all I'm going to talk about here today. Let's hear your thoughts on all that was discussed today down in the comment section. Definitely, what do you think about the Blues naming a captain? Who do you think it's going to be? We'll probably know by the time this video is on YouTube. Do you think it was a good choice, whoever they pick? Do you see the Avalanche and Devils possibly moving those two top prospects in Olausson and Stillman by the deadline? I think it's extremely likely, and I think both those guys will be extremely likely trade chips for those two teams. Do the Canadiens move Dvorak in season? It's possible. Monahan, I think both those two could possibly be the best trade chips for the Canadiens. Does Saros get moved at the deadline if the Preds are out of a playoff spot? I think it's extremely likely given the fact that there would be a lot of teams interested, and Khaira is a guy who can step into the role as early as next year and be a good starter. Will the Canucks wind up moving a player? I think it's a formality at this point. They just have to try and figure out a way to make the cap work. So it's going to be still difficult, but I still think one of Pearson, Besser, Beauvillier, Garland, Myers, one of those guys is going to have to get moved before the season starts. And do you think that Pinto winds up getting traded? I personally think that he's probably still going to sign a 1-year deal probably, and going to find a way to move cap space. But do you think there's a possibility Pinto gets moved to a team like Philly or Boston? Definitely. Love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. So that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video, and if you really like to, remember to subscribe down below. I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. So definitely check that out. I've linked in the description below. Don't forget to stay tuned for upcoming videos talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. And definitely, I can't wait to see you guys all for next video. See you guys soon.